Welcome back to Worldview. Now, once again, our good friend Robert Hunziker is back to scare the living daylights out of me. In a recent article for UK Progressive magazine, he tackled the deniers, who pointed to minuscule decreases and trends who say the world is actually cooling. Well, the Earth temperature is cooling. Because the other day he introduced a new topic and deeper research into the climate change debate, showing that indeed we've got an even bigger problem. It's called heat sink. And Robert joins us today to discuss how dangerous it is becoming and how, coupled with permafrost methane melt, moves us rapidly closer towards a catastrophic climate event. Robert Hunziker, welcome back to Worldview.
Yeah, hi Dennis, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing good today, Robert, thank you, but it sounds like by the time we're finished, I'm hoping I still am doing okay. It sounds like we're in some pretty deep doo-doo here. Let's start with heat sink. Why is it so important?
Well, the heat sink is the fact that the oceans are absorbing enormous quantities of excess heat that's being absorbed in the earth. And when you talk about heat content of the planet Earth, that includes three things. It includes the atmosphere, it includes the land, and it includes the oceans. Now, if you look at a chart of where all of this is going, and these kind of things are done by the U.S. Geophysical Society, and if you look at the chart, you'll see where a sliver of all of this heat content the Earth is absorbing goes into the atmosphere and into the land. And then a mountain over the molehill of the land and atmosphere is the ocean absorbing all of this excess heat. The reason I say a mountain is if you look at a chart, it looks like Mount Everest.
We've got that chart now up on the screen so viewers at home can see exactly what it is you're talking about. So yes, please do continue.
Right, and the blue is the ocean and the heat that's being absorbed in the ocean. The way they measure this, by the way, it's not guesswork. They've got these Argo floats that have been positioned in the oceans of the world. There are 3,000 of these floats positioned in the oceans of the world. And every 10 days, an Argo float will drop, they'll submerge it down to about 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles in the ocean. It then subsequently takes 6 hours to rise, taking temperature readings and salinity readings on the way back up to surface. When it gets to the surface, it then sends that data off to satellites, and it's retrieved by scientists who say, aha, here's what the temperature is at 0.5 mile down in the ocean, and 1 mile and 1/4 mile. So this is real stuff, and it's warming up. The oceans are absorbing all this excess heat. Meanwhile, we've got these climate change denial type people, typically fossil fuel related interests like the Hartman Institute, the Koch brothers, all these kind of people spending a lot of money to create websites like Climate Depot, which where they take the other side of the argument, and they talk about, well, the climate really hasn't warmed much the last 10 to 15 years on the land temperature. It's all been absorbed into the ocean.
Yeah, that Climate Depot name of a website there sounds extraordinarily glib. And, we've got some fairly serious topics that are being ignored by the deniers. We've got warming oceans. We've got acidification levels rising. We've got coral reefs dying. I mean, even last week I read that the lobsters in the northeastern part of the United States, which are supposedly involved in a boom, are actually in a bubble, and they're likely to go extinct very, very quickly. What kind of a toxic soup is it that we're mixing up here?
It's a toxic soup is exactly the way to put it, because the acidification is extraordinarily severe. Growing extraordinarily severe. I mean, we've got shellfish operations here in the United States off the coast of Washington, for example, that have appealed to Congress to do something to try to help, because the shellfish aren't maturing and developing the way they should. They lose a lot of their product. The ocean acidification problem, and why do we have the ocean acidification problem? It's excessive CO2 being absorbed into the oceans. That's what causes it. The oceans have a certain level amount of CO2, as does our atmosphere. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have a warm, temperate planet. But it's the excess that causes the problems. And the excess that the oceans are experiencing are creating potentially extinction events for marine life. And that's, in fact, the people who really understand this the best feel that we're on track for an extinction of 9 million species of marine life by the end of this century. So that's just one more problem. There are layers of problems when it comes to the oceans absorbing as much heat as they're absorbing. You know, it was a little over a year ago when Dr. James Hansen spoke at a TED conference in Southern California. And one of the things he said that startled people is he said the Earth is absorbing the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs per day, excessive. And I thought to myself, that doesn't seem possible. But once you start to look into the science, it's being absorbed by the oceans.
We're talking with the environmental journalist Robert Hunziker here on Worldview with Dennis Campbell. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that we're having 400,000 Hiroshima explosions per day in terms of the energy that's being released, the excess energy that we can't seem to handle. You know, I've also been looking and have seen some terrifying charts of radiation, I mean, such as strontium from Fukushima and in oceans currents that go all the way across the Pacific to the United States, to South America, all across the world. And at what point does all of this tip?
Boy, I wish I knew, Dennis, but we're certainly building up to something where the problem will be when you do get that tipping point, and implied in that is that there's no turning back. Okay, we don't. I don't think anybody really knows, but it appears that it's coming. It may come sooner rather than later, because these things are happening so quickly. You and one of our prior discussions mentioned the fact that in 30 years, we're spewing as much CO2 into the atmosphere as it normally took 10,000 years for it to happen in more of a natural way. So, I think the time scale is working very much against us. We've really got to get off fossil fuels. We've got to get on renewables. There are some geoengineering things that they're looking at that can be done to maybe help solve the problem, certainly over the Arctic. They believe they can spew some sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, these chips of it, into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight off to try to revive the ice in the Arctic. We've lost 50% of the ice mass already in the Arctic. It's going to be ice-free in a few years. That then triggers the methane problem that we've got. And one thing triggers another. So you could get to the point where this whole thing just explodes on us.
And of course, the drilling of all these holes and releasing of methane via fracking and all sorts of other unconventional gas exploration. I mean, that's got to be a major issue going forward. I was listening to a fascinating program yesterday on the BBC where they had two scientists come in and they were talking about the Arctic versus the Antarctic, just as we had on an earlier program. And they said basically, you know, the same as you had said, that the Arctic is made up of ice that is sitting on top of water. So that's just displacing the water. That's no problem. But the real issue is going to be when the ice sheets in the Antarctic and the Himalayas across the glaciers and even Greenland, when that all melts and has to go somewhere, you're going to see dramatic rises in sea. So, I mean, we sit on all this land that's being destroyed by all this. It can't be happening. It can't be helping, right? I mean, when are we going to wake up and see that this is a really serious issue?
I think it will happen when we have problems with food supply, and the way that happens, of course, is that the Arctic is altering the jet streams, the warming of the Arctic, that is, okay, and it elongates them and it actually slows them down, so that when we do have these weather problems, droughts, you'll notice they become embedded for months sometimes. Yeah. Same thing with horrible storms. They become more embedded and more torrential. That's impacting our ability to grow crops around the world. And I think that'll be the first tipping point, if you will, is we're going to start to have shortages of food. We're already starting to see a lot of signs of that worldwide, serious problems. And what happens when you have food shortages? It leads to food riots. Right. Food riots lead to political turmoil, lead to war. So it's going to be an uncomfortable world. And I think at that point in time, I don't even know if anything can be done about it at that point in time. That's the problem. You got to do something now. You can't wait until the tipping point hits. That's too late.
Well, yeah, of course, and as we've seen over the last couple of days in Egypt, I mean, this could be our future in terms of riots and reactions, etc. You know, as usual, Robert, you've managed to scare me to death, and I want to thank you for taking the time to come and join us. It's beginning to look as though that $60 trillion US dollar price tag for the cost and impact of climate change was just a beginning.
You bet. Nice to see you again.
Robert Hunziker is a freelance journalist who writes for a number of progressive publications, including our own UK Progressive. And his personal mission statement is to simplify the understanding of climate change through essays and articles based upon his research of the science. He cuts through all of the BS, all of the jargon to help us understand the severity of the real problem here. You're watching Worldview with Dennis Campbell. Stay right here.